Hello, my name is Bobbie Carlton. I am the editor-in-chief and publisher of Lioness magazine. And today I am here with Ramani Varanasi. She is the co-founder, chief executive officer, and the president of X-Biotix Therapeutics. And I will say, I have to tell you folks, she absolutely riveted my attention on her 100% when she said that she was preparing us for the next pandemic. So welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today, Ramani.
Thank you very much, Bobbie.
So tell us a little bit about your company, and then I want to dive down into what you meant when you said getting prepared for the next pandemic.
Absolutely. And again, thanks for inviting me to participate on this very lovely chat as this unveils here. So by way of background, I can't talk about where I am today without talking about what I've done or what my background is. So I'm a microbiologist by training, so a scientist, but left the bench years ago. So now I play a scientist on TV. I've been in the corporate world in biopharma for about 25 years or so. And, biopharma has a new coming, if you will, with the COVID pandemic. I think the world is seeing this industry in a very different light, and we can address that when we get to the discussion on the pandemic. But I co-founded X-Biotix Therapeutics about 4.5 years ago, and with good intentions. And as a group, we were well intentioned in that we wanted to tackle the underlying issue of bacterial resistance, or superbugs, as we often know them. There's lots of news out there about the concept of superbugs, and the idea is to really develop novel classes of clinically differentiated drugs, or antibiotics in this case, to address this rapidly growing unmet need of multi-drug resistance, of infectious diseases. And so I founded the company along with some Harvard co-founders, and we said, let's just get really busy and let's think about how we can make a change, make a dent in this space of resistant bacteria. And I would often joke with my team early on, they vetoed me, but I thought it was a great idea. I would say, how about we use the tagline, resistance is futile? And they said, oh, that would be great, but we can't do that, Ramani. So, in the end, we're working on addressing bacterial resistance at its core, because as we all know, we as humans adapt to environments. We're very resilient, and well, guess what? Bacteria are as well. They adapt to their environments, and that's how they develop resistance. So again, just by way of background, I'm a scientist, but now focused on commercial and business endeavors, and I am also a female entrepreneur. I've had fun starting this company and running this company, and I'm dealing with all sorts of ups and downs. Happy to address that later, but I'm glad to be here and glad to be representing X-Biotix in our mission of really getting clinically differentiated antibiotics to the global marketplace.
And of course, I'm so tempted to say, resistance is futile, and, it's a 5-year mission, right? And, to seek out new life.
Right. Where it's never been taught before. Exactly.
We've got the whole fangirl thing going here.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about kind of how you got started. What was the aha moment for you?
Well, okay. So, I like to think the universe works in some really mysterious ways. And by working or by co-founding this company, or sort of the reason I ended up here, I guess, is the easiest way to say this, is this concept or this initiative brought me full circle. In that I started off as a scientist, a microbiologist, studying bacteria, learning about bacteria, and working in labs and in a pharmaceutical company doing that. And then I left the bench. I moved away, and I did different things, and I worked in pharma and biopharma and startups and big and small companies, etc. And then I found myself in this position where I had an opportunity to collaborate with the great minds at Harvard who have been thinking about bacterial genetics and bacterial biology. And this initiative really brought me back full circle to my roots of microbiology. So I thought, aha, this is my chance to jump at doing something that I started my career with. But more importantly, I should say, as importantly, I really wanted to undertake the initiative of starting a company. It's always been something I've been curious about. And so for me, it was, the aha piece of that was, here's an opportunity that allows me to really take the reins and to drive something. If it's successful, I'm part of that success. If it's a failure, I'm part of that failure, but it's me, it's on me. And so for me, that the aha moment there is the concept of, how should I say, authenticity and individual impact that I could have with respect to this new co that I founded, and now that is, developing novel antibiotics. So it's full circle philosophically, but also the concept of starting something new and seeing where I could take it.
Great. That's it makes sense to me. It's like, I have to admit, microbiology, all of those things, not my area. I started a smaller company, and yet I think there's a lot of stuff that when you're a founder, you're concerned about. And one of them is funding, and funding for something with such a long runway has always been one of those, oh my goodness, I'm thanking goodness I don't have to do that. How did you deal with the fact that, you've got a long runway as a bio company?
Yeah. Well, one of the things I think about every day, I sort of reflect on all the time, is the concept of funding. That's my role. My job is to bring in funding. It's to continue to ensure that the company has an appropriate amount of runway to survive, and not only just to survive, but rather to build value. And so, I'm not gonna kid myself or kid you in saying it wasn't challenging finding funding. I think any entrepreneur, when you're out there pitching an idea, it's you against the rest of them, and it's your job to create the story and bring people in with that story. But also, as part of creating the story, be very factual about it. We can't speak with alternative facts. We have to really be really solid about what we are putting on the table and addressing as a critical unmet need that we uniquely think we're ready or we're well positioned to fulfill or to fill. And so I spent many months in the beginning talking to everybody that I possibly could and telling my story and navigating that process and massaging it and retelling it and getting input from people who've done this in the past and people who are experts in the space. And we finally landed some investors who said, we are actually very intrigued by what you do. But we're not the normal types of investors. We actually are double bottom line focused investors, in that the investor group I have right now is interested or very curious and sort of focused on the relevance and the importance of global health and what they can do to make an impact on global health, but also the thing that every other investor is focused on, which is return. So this is what uniquely differentiated the group of investors I have today from a typical venture investor that would invest in companies. Now, it seemed right to take that investment, and so we did, and here we are. We're building value and creating drugs. But the concept of fundraising is just one of those things where you're constantly out there talking about. And I will say, because I can't talk about fundraising in antibiotics without mentioning this point, and that is that fundraising in antibiotics is very, very, very challenging. Now, we hear about living in this pandemic, COVID pandemic, and I read the news all the time about, in my space, about biopharma and investments. Investors are throwing money at biopharmaceutical companies. So with that comment alone, the assumption there is that I should be drowning in money. I as a company, we as a company. However, at the end of the day, what is important in this field and for this group of investors, as is true in any other field, is how can we make money? How can we be commercially successful? And this brings us right back to the challenge that we as an organization face, among many other organizations in this space of antibiotics, is that the commercial market space is broken. It's a miss. There is a paradox in that if I as a company am successful in developing a drug and getting it onto the market, the street investors, I should say the street in general, there'll be a downward pressure on my company, in that I will be seen as less valued as a company compared to compared to before I launched that drug, which just seems completely flip on end if you think about it. And that's just because that once a drug is launched, what happens to it is that the hospitals will take it and they'll shelve it. In the case of antibiotics, because you don't want to overtreat patients, because then they will develop bacteria that are resistant. So it's a little bit of a circular argument in that we're developing drugs to treat resistance, but the drug itself is going to be shelved. So this becomes, coming back to your question on funding and fundraising, it becomes a really interesting story to weave and to tell in a way that is compelling to investors. Now, all that said, there are many incentives out there in terms of funding incentives that we and other companies can take advantage of to fund these valleys of death in the context of the preclinical early stage pipeline or development phase of our programs or our compounds, our assets. And so we navigate those valleys of death and we get funding in to satisfy our needs at the time. And then we take our assets to some value inflection point and then we go and try to seek more funding. But I will say in summary that fundraising in this space is quite challenging, but there is a critical unmet need we are serving. And so, we are living in a pandemic, and I can speak in a second if you'd like to what that means from a bacterial resistance perspective and why it's important that private investors, but more importantly, the government, and the government's doing a lot, by the way, lots of incentives that they've put out there to get companies like ours funded, why it's important that they continue to do that. So apologies for the long response, but I'm very sort of dedicated and passionate about this topic, so I can go on about fundraising.
Actually, I want to take us to that pandemic. So we are all living it these days. My God, I can't even think to the end of this pandemic these days. What is going to happen with the next one?
Yeah. Well, so let me just start off by saying, just throwing a few stats out there, just to sort of set the framework, and then I'll talk about why bacterial infections matter in the context of what we're living in today and why they matter in the future. Just some stats I'll throw out. So the first is that there are 2.8 million infections, bacterial infections in the US on an annual basis. And these are of bacterial resistant pathogens. So these are bacteria that are resistant to any drug. So there's 2.8 million people who get infected in the US alone on an annual basis with these drug resistant bacteria, out of which 35,000 of them die. Why? Because no drug available, no antibacterial available will treat them. So that's a lot of deaths. Now let's just pause there a second and compare it to the COVID pandemic. And I just wrote some stats down before coming on the call. As of today, in the US, there are 8.6 million diagnosed cases of COVID. So let's just compare that for a second with the 2.8 million infections for bacteria. They're both pretty high numbers. There are 228,000 deaths as of today in the US with COVID deaths in the US. That's a pretty large percentage. But when you look at, again, on a percentage basis with the bacterial resistance deaths, they're pretty comparable. So why is everyone focusing on a COVID pandemic? And please believe me, I'm not suggesting we shouldn't. I mean, we should clearly address COVID and identify diagnostics and therapeutics and tests to accommodate the issue we're in. But the reality is that the last time we have discovered a novel antibiotic was 40 years ago. And the reason resistance continues in bacteria is because we're bombarding them with known drugs, known chemical entities, and not new drugs. So one would think that we should focus on developing new drugs, but we haven't. And what has happened as a result, the antibiotic resistance movement, if I can use that term, has continued to increase. And so resistance is on an increase. There are not enough drugs, novel drugs, to accommodate that. So it is growing at a slightly slower pace, if you will, compared to the COVID pandemic, but we are going to get there if we don't today invest in antibiotics that will address that increase in resistance over time. And so what's happening, interestingly enough, so we're in this COVID pandemic, and the government and many other funders are really sort of, channeling all their funds to addressing the COVID pandemic in terms of identifying diagnostics, therapeutics, etc., to treat our current situation as they should. But what that's doing as a result is it's limiting the ability for companies like ours to raise money in this space. So when we go to, as an example, the CARES Act that was passed recently, there are provisions in that accommodate for COVID funding if you're a COVID specific asset, but not if you're a bacterial asset. So again, I get that, and there's a reason the government is doing that. The CARES Act was passed to specifically support COVID-related issues, but we need to be mindful that we cannot avoid being mindful and aware, acutely aware of the bacterial pandemic. That we don't call it a pandemic, it's an epidemic, but it'll very quickly become a pandemic. And a couple of other stats I will just add here that it's really important for people to know that with COVID, approximately 50% of the patients that have died from this COVID pandemic, there's been an associated bacterial infection. And I'm not sure exactly the percentage of which have been drug-resistant bacteria, but there's a large percentage. And so what that's showing us is that many of the patients that are afflicted with COVID are also suffering from secondary bacterial infections, and they may succumb to that infection if it's drug-resistant. So there in itself is a valid reason for us to continue to be mindful of the fact that the bacterial epidemic and soon to be pandemic is not going away. The funding has to continue. A couple of other things I'll mention: the 2009 swine flu and the 1918 influenza pandemic. Guess what the majority of deaths from both of those situations was caused from? It was not from the influenza. It was from the bacterial infection associated with the viral infection. So, there's enough data points out there for us to be really cognizant and mindful of the fact that we cannot forget that novel antibiotics play a role. We wouldn't have modern medicine in the way it is today in the absence of antibiotics. I mean, penicillin was the first one discovered, I think in 1928 by Alexander Fleming, and look what it did. It saved a lot of lives. And so, I can continue speaking about why it's important for us to focus on the bacterial side of things when we're thinking about the COVID pandemic. But this is something that people in this field really have embraced, which is the notion that this pandemic is about around the corner, and we have to focus on putting more money into the space to fund companies like ourselves.
Ramani, what can we do?
That's a great question. It's an interesting question. I think, from a public perspective, public awareness is the first and foremost. I mean, if we're not aware, then we can't be speaking to an issue. So I think at a minimum, part of what my role is as the CEO of this company is to educate the people I talk to. It's the investors I speak with, it's the public I speak with, it's my possible, potential collaborators I speak with, possible advisors I speak with. So I'm getting information and I'm sort of sharing it with my team and assembling it and then disseminating it to people like yourselves and others. So I would say awareness is a big thing. There is a lot of work that is going on the legislative side, on the congressional side. There are several bills that are trying to get passed and into law, and they've kind of gotten stuck in the congressional process, and now we're sitting in an election year. I'll just go back to what I mentioned about the commercial paradox. A big portion of the ability to get companies funded, number one, and number two, for products to be successful in this space is going to be addressed through reimbursement reform and other commercial incentives. I've spent a lot of time being part of coalitions and being part of thought groups or thinking groups, or I'm not sure what the term is, but thought leaders, groups that really lead these initiatives to get this discussion on the Hill. And the reality here is that if we don't get reimbursement reform in place soon and other incentives that allow companies that are slightly later stage than us, that have products to market, in a position where they can be commercially successful, then what happens is we all walk away, we all go away, not because we want to, because there's no more funding available for us. And so I would say, coming back to your question about what can you do, what can the public do, it's be aware that if there are representatives in, in your communities and or in your districts that can support the legislative process, which they all can, lots of senators and representatives are out there talking and thinking about this, then it's, the public could get involved in making this topic a little bit more frontline than it currently is. And again, not to take away anything from COVID, because we all have to focus on getting out of this pandemic, but we also can't lose sight of the fact that the bacterial resistance piece is behind it. And if we don't get reimbursement reform taken care of and other commercial incentives taken care of and manufacturing and access to ultimate patients addressed, then companies like ours wither away. And then we're going to be 3, 4, 5 years from now, whenever we're in this bacterial pandemic, running amok, doing exactly what we're doing in COVID, that is not being prepared and trying to catch up.
Great. Wow. Thank you so much for joining us today. And any last words of wisdom?
I would just say that, I think any company that's working in this space, or even in biopharma, I think we're all just trying to develop drugs to get out to patients at the end of the day. And each company is going to have their niche that they're focused on and their passion that they're focused on. I think for entrepreneurs and especially female entrepreneurs who want to make a difference, I was told before I started this, just if you don't do it, you'll never know how you can or can't do it. And so I would just, tell folks out there who are considering being part of new initiatives and thinking of entrepreneurism to go after what you can and see if you can make a difference. And at the end of the day, that's all we're really trying to do, is make a difference and try to improve healthcare here. So thanks again, Bobbie.
Thank you.